Is there such thing as perfect form? And can it help reduce your injury risk? Find out in this episode of Monday Mornings with Michael. So most people have either done rehab for some sort of injury or they've done some sort of training program where there's somebody there to help them with their form and their technique. And the idea is that if you practice with good form and good technique, that you'll reduce your injury risk. For example, the squat assessment is a really common screen used to see if someone should squat. Either a personal trainer, chiropractor, or physical therapist will look at your squatting form and they'll note whether your thighs break parallel, your knees cave in, your feet, how far they're rotated in or out, or if your arches are collapsing or something like that. And so they'll try to prevent those things from happening or fix those things so that way you can squat and that way you don't get injured. Another example would be if you're a runner and somebody did a gait analysis on you, so they watched how you ran. And so somebody would have looked at your foot pronation, knee positioning, whether your knees are in or out, your hip drive, so how high your knees are going up, arm positioning, all that kind of stuff. And chances are if you've done that, you probably came away with, you're probably running wrong. The problem with all these things is that there doesn't seem to be like an ideal way to run, an ideal way to squat. Movement seems to be more individual specific and then also context specific as well. What I mean by that is that if we look at like the individual factors, they vary between people. So my hip structure and your hip structure are probably going to be a little bit different. My hip is a little bit more shallow, which means that where the actual bone sits, this part isn't as deep. So I have a lot more mobility, so I can do a deep squat, which would be required in a CrossFit squat, for example, or Olympic lifting. Whereas if someone has a deeper hip socket, so their socket's actually like that, they have a lot more stability, but they won't have as much mobility. So no matter how much that person does stretching, mobility work, and all that kind of stuff, their bone structure is actually what's going to dictate how deep they squat. So if we're training for the same thing, that person's going to be at a disadvantage because their hip anatomy just doesn't let them squat that deep. The context of movement will also dictate what's an appropriate movement. For example, since the Winter Olympic Games just happened, let's take a look at skiers and snowboarders doing the big air versus a weightlifter. When those athletes are doing big air, they're jumping off. And when they land, they typically land in a lot of spinal flexion, so they'll land in a position somewhat like that. If you take a look at low back injury mechanisms, that's a great way to either injure a disc or something like that because you have spinal flexion plus a lot of load all put on that low back. However, for these athletes to be able to absorb that amount of load of jumping basically off of a 2 or 3 story building, they have to do that to absorb the force. Whereas if we look at that weightlifter, if they're doing squats and deadlifts, we wouldn't tell them to round their back when they lift. If we took the advice we gave to the weightlifters to the snowboarders or skiers doing the big air, then we're probably actually setting those athletes up for injury, and that's because they're going to have to load somewhere else, which isn't used to that kind of loading. If you've played sports, there's the common saying that perfect practice makes perfect. And while it's important to practice, there's not really such a thing as perfect practice. For example, LeBron has shot up hundreds and thousands of free throws, and he practices dunks probably that same amount, yet every once in a while, he still misses a free throw or he misses a dunk. Same thing with Rory McIlroy in golf. He's practiced his golf swing hundreds of thousands of times and he's played for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, yet every once in a while, he still takes a shot. The point is that motor control isn't perfect. There's always going to be a chance that there's going to be some sort of error or some sort of flaw that occurs whenever we try to move. Things are going to happen whether in sport or just in life in general. We're going to invert our ankles, we're going to go into knee valgus, we're going to bend our backs. All these things are going to happen, so instead of trying to avoid these movements, we should actually expose athletes and people to these movements gradually so that way they have the strength and the motor control in those positions, so that way they don't get injured. After all, it'd be much better to expose someone to a movement, let's say an ankle inversion or knee collapse or pronation or something like that, in a controlled environment where we can modify the loads and get them to slowly adapt to that position, than it is in sport when they first experience that movement. If we go back to looking at the context of movements, take for example a soccer player. So if they're on defense and the opponent cuts one direction, that defender is going to cut as well, and so chances are their knee's going to go into a little bit of knee valgus while they do that. It's much more beneficial if we have strengthened them in that position, so that way when they cut, the first time they experience that movement isn't out on the field, so that way now they have strength and motor control, and that way they're not just relying on ligaments and fascia to hold them up, they actually have muscle support there in that position. Now, I'm not saying that form and technique and biomechanics aren't important. They are important, but when we're looking from an injury standpoint, we need to expose our athletes to movements and positions that they're probably going to experience on field or in competition. That way they're not experiencing them for the first time out on the field. If we look at a training program, we kind of want to make like a nice little bell curve. So majority of the movements are going to be in relatively good form. There's a little bit of variance there, but we want to be in some decent form while we're doing those. But we still need to expose our athletes to the tail ends where they, if we have a football player, they might be way out here trying to catch a ball or grab a player. We want them to be strong in this position. Or if we're looking at a volleyball player who's going to land with some knee valgus, we want to expose them to that position so they're stronger in that spot. And that way they don't get injured while out on the court or out on the field or wherever. In summary, there's no such thing as perfect form or an ideal movement pattern. It's always going to vary on the individual and on the actual circumstance that someone's in. So instead of focusing on building a perfect movement or something like that, we should focus on building a robust person that's able to tolerate movements in all sorts of varieties.